weekend, overnight, or whatever, we can just stay all night and call CQ. But anyway, I'm not sure we'll get to that point, but we're going to redo the shack, maybe come up with a new bookcase. If you notice, someone was working on the Wi-Fi and they broke the old bookcase. We were ready to go. Okay. Well, we're trying something new tonight. Don says we're live. That's great. So we have the Rowan Amateur Society with us tonight. We're streaming live on YouTube, and we're glad to have Gary Lang and the rest of the guys down there in the Rowan Club with us. And when the presentation starts, and I'm sure there's folks watching from home too. So if you have a question during the program tonight, there is a YouTube chat feature on YouTube that you can use to just type in your questions. Also, we have our, we're monitoring 145.470, our repeater. It has 100 hertz tone, and you can contact us on 2 meters if you have a question. Also, you can call us at area code 336-930-W4NC. That's 930-W4NC. You can call us. We've got the phone manned. You can ask your question, and we'll get that answered for you. We're honored tonight to have Stuart Smalkin with us, WA5EYI. Stuart is the curator of the Asheville Radio Museum. I think there's a fancy name for it that eludes me right now. But anyway, this is going to be a great program. And we welcome Stuart. The floor is yours, sir.
I am indeed Stuart, and I'm really glad to be here. I can't tell you how much we appreciate the support of the amateur radio community in North Carolina, and I thought you might enjoy learning a little bit about the radio museum we have over in Asheville. Just by a show of hands, has anybody ever actually been there yet? Not a surprise. I know it's a little bit of a drive.
Saw it on UNC.
You saw it on UNC. I'm glad somebody saw it. It actually took a year to get them to do that show for us, but persistence paid off. As you can tell from my call sign, I'm not from around these parts. I'm born and bred in New Orleans, Louisiana. Got flooded out by Hurricane Katrina about 10 years ago and decided to come live up here on a mountain. So far we're keeping our heads above water. We call this presentation the Asheville Radio Museum, What's New? But I thought since you have not been there yet, it might be worthwhile at least talking a little bit about how it came to be. And then what I'll do is show you something about the way we've been trying to expand the museum in the past couple of years. Applause already. Has anybody ever heard of or had a session with Carl Smith in 488? He's the author of, or was the author of DX Magazine. He passed away a couple of years ago, and he's actually responsible for getting the museum started. He's an amateur radio operator, and so is his wife. And so one day for his birthday, his wife handed him a old 1930s radio. He said, "Thank you, dear." And then she said, "Well, why don't you start a museum?" So he got together with about 3 or 4 other amateur radio operators in Asheville, and they decided to start a museum. And we have a community college there. It's called AB Tech. It's Asheville Buncombe County Technical College. And one of those 4 guys was an instructor. And so there was an empty storeroom there, and he asked the school if they might allow him and his group to set up a museum there. So the school said yes, and this was back in 2001, and they said, we'll give you a year, and we can't make any promises after that. But here we are in 2020, and so we're going on 19 years, and we're still there, and we're going strong. So I hope one day you get a chance to visit, but if you don't, I thought what I'd do is walk you through some of the things we're trying to do there, because we're very excited about it. What you saw in this picture, all of this over here is the amateur radio side. So you guys are hams. When we have hams that come, mostly all I want to do is look at the ham equipment. But what I'd like to do is introduce you to some of the other things that we're doing as well. We're a small group, but we're passionate about radio. And so if you saw us on the TV the other day, what we try to do is we amaze and educate and fascinate. And I really think that's exactly what we do. When I say we amaze, you ever talk to any of your friends about radio and how amazing a radio wave is? 'Cause we find it to be amazing, and we have all kind of people who come in who are not hams. Some of them have a drug problem. And what I mean by that is their husband is a ham and they got drug along. So we try to make it interesting for them too. So first when we say we amaze, we start talking about how amazing a radio wave is. So how fast does a radio wave go?
186,000 miles.
Exactly, 186,000 miles a second. So if we send a radio signal to the moon, which is 238,000 miles away, it's going to get there in less than 2 seconds. And then we contrast that with sound wave. How fast does a sound wave go? Yeah, it's about a fifth of a mile per second. So quite a difference. Now, if we generate a sound wave, can that sound wave travel through the vacuum of space? No. It can't, because a sound wave requires a medium, whereas a radio wave does not. Now, is a sound wave self-perpetuating? No, it's going to die out. But as we know, radio waves are self-perpetuating. And we actually explain to people that a radio wave is not just one wave, it's 2 waves. That's why it's called an electromagnetic wave. And so as one part of the electrical wave is dying out, it's generating the next part of the magnetic wave. And as that's dying out, it's generating the next part of the electrical wave. So going through space, if there's nothing to interfere with it, it's going to go on forever. It's the law of conservation of energy. So when we explain these things and contrast it with a sound wave, all of a sudden they start thinking about it and they find it very interesting. So they're amazed by what a radio wave can do. When we say we educate, one of the big challenges that we have in the museum is most people don't get very excited when you say radio. It just, it's not internet, it's not sexy these days. But we try and remind people of how important radio waves are in our daily lives today. You ever try and do that? Well, let me ask you this. Is a cell phone a radio?
Yeah.
Okay. Does GPS use radio? Does wireless internet at home use radio? Yeah. Okay. So what we actually do, especially with the classes that come through, is I'll give them this pop quiz. And I'll put up this list of things, and I'll challenge them to pick out what on there does not depend on radio. And of course, it's a trick question because, as we know, everything that's on this list depends on radio. And so once you start to get them thinking about how important radio is in their lives, and it's not just the thing on the dashboard of their car that they don't use anymore, all of a sudden their interest level goes up. So I thought what you might enjoy seeing, and you'll have to use your imagination for a second, but if any of you listen to National Public Radio, I guess you have an NPR station here, this is a story that was done on the Radio Museum in Asheville by a woman named Helen Chickering. So if the sound works, we'll get a chance to hear it. Let's see. No, the sound didn't work. Try it one more time.
I'm Helen Chickering with BPR News. When you think of tourist attractions here in western North Carolina, places like the Biltmore House or the Blue Ridge Parkway come to mind. But if you hang around here long enough, you eventually learn about the lesser-known spots, including one hidden in the halls of a community college. Tucked away in a quiet hall on the AB Tech College campus is a small museum full of history for the ear. There's vintage music.
Scratched up a little bit,
Historical moments like this live account of the Hindenburg disaster.
That's enough to keep it from the worst in the place. Get it started. It's fighting and it's fighting. It's fighting terrible. Oh my, get out of the way.
And all sorts of beeps and buzzes. So tell me what this is.
This is an old, early 1900s Morse code machine that people would use to practice to develop their skills at deciphering Morse code as it came down the telegraph wires or over the radio. My name is Stuart Smolkin, and we are at AB Tech College, and we're in the Department of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and you are dead center at the South's largest collection of antique radio equipment.
Welcome to the Asheville Radio Museum. Smolkin is one of the volunteer curators. Right here in Western North Carolina, how did that land here?
It landed here due to the dedicated efforts of some amateur radio operators that started this collection about 2001. And they put out the word to other amateur radio operators in the area, and that led to most of the donations that you see here today.
We shall now broadcast the election returns.
A collection that traces the history of radio, starting with the early days of spark gap transmitters.
It generates the spark. The spark generates a radio wave, and of course the short is a dot, the long is a dash, and so that's how radio transmission got started.
Along with the ears, there are treats for the eyes. Vintage radios line one side of the room like sculptures in an art museum.
The earliest radios that came out were made by a company called Atwater Kent, which was the gentleman's name, and he thought that his components were so beautiful that he actually didn't put them in a case. He left the innards exposed for everybody to see because they're so beautiful, which they are. And in fact, let's take a look at this radio here, which is a later Atwater Kent, which is from the middle 1920s. And if you can picture the beautiful dials and look inside and those gorgeous vacuum tubes that look like shiny mirrors and such, and this was indeed a work of art.
Next to the beautiful is the practical, a section on the impact of radio on rural America with a focus on farmers.
Saturday fair and slightly warmer. The radio in the 1920s was the internet of its day for farmers. They could get crop reports, pricing reports, so they would know when to bring their crop to market. They could get advanced weather reports. They could get training from the U.S. Department of Agriculture on how to use fertilizer or how to manage diseases with their animals. So it just was the information superhighway of 1920s is the best way to describe it.
At the core of this radio wave wonder room is a whole section dedicated to amateur radio, including a working amateur radio station where you can tune in to the International Space Station.
Alpha 100, I'm not hearing you at the moment.
The amazing thing about amateur radio is that even though it started back in the early 1900s, you would think the interest has faded because of cell phones and the internet and such. And yet the number of amateur radio operators in the country continues to grow and is about to hit 800,000 licensed operators in the United States. And there's more than 20,000 licensed operators in North Carolina alone.
The museum even offers ham operator courses. It's a radio treasure trove just off the beaten tourist track. At the Asheville Radio Museum, I'm Helen Chickering, BPR News.
What do you think?
Good.
Yeah, nice.
I think she did a nice job. I mean, she just came in cold into the museum, but she was actually pretty fascinated by it herself. She works for a radio station, so I think it was particularly interesting to her just because of her profession. One thing that's nice about the women when they come in too is they really appreciate the beauty of the old radios. And any of you who collect and restore the old 1920s radios, you know how nice they look. So we actually have a photo exhibit of those on our website. We'll talk about it in a minute. I'm going to show you one more that I hope you find interesting. This is the story that was done on the museum by the North Carolina Weekend, and this just runs for a couple of minutes, but I think they did a nice job as well.
A radio wave is something we take for granted, and it's not the simplest concept to understand. Thanks to the Asheville Radio Museum, we're taught the wonders of this late 19th century discovery.
A radio wave can actually travel at 186,000 miles per second. Radio wave is enabled the kind of mass communication that allows people in one place and in a far distant place to have a connection, an immediate connection that before radio simply wasn't possible.
In 1877, Heinrich Hertz, a German scientist, proved that radio waves exist, and it all started with an electrical spark.
In the early days of radio, it was not possible to send music or speech over the radio. All you could do is create sparks. And the spark actually generates a radio wave. So if I turn on this radio here, every time I press the telegraph key, it creates sparks, and the sparks can be used to send Morse code messages.
In the early 1900s, the Triode vacuum tube was invented. This technology was used to send wireless voice and music transmissions, which eventually launched radio broadcasting in the 1920s. Radio suddenly brought people together, sometimes during tragic events.
This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flames rising to the ground.
Well, the Asheville Radio Museum is both a teaching organization and a repository for various artifacts from the history of radio. We started off with about 20 or 30 radios, and that snowballed. So there's one side that's devoted to the history of amateur radio.
This is Whiskey 4, America Foxtrot Mike.
And on the other side is the broadcast radio and development of radio and electronics. The museum is located in Asheville Buncombe Technical College, and in particular we're in the Department of Engineering and Applied Sciences.
I find that the majority of people learn more by putting their hands on it than they do all the theory on the board all day long. Once they do it, then it changes everything.
So Rose, this is our early 1900s Morse code practice machine that people would use to build up their speed. Let's see how it works.
It's safe to say there's something for everyone at the Asheville Radio Museum.
Places like this are important because they help remind kids of history and where we came from. And for me personally, it exposed me to a whole new hobby and area that I didn't really know existed that's perfect for me.
A place to see the kind of history and that has built the technology that we have today. And it's not something that's very easy to see because there aren't very many of these collections in the whole country. I'd say our job here with visitors is to amaze, to fascinate, and to educate, and that's what we attempt to do, whether they like radio or not.
The Asheville Radio Museum is at 315 Elm Building on the campus of Asheville Buncombe Technical Community College, and they're open every Friday from 1 to 3, February through November, and by appointment. For more information, visit their website at avlradiomuseum.org.
Hold your applause, it's all right. Believe it or not, they spent close to 3 hours in the museum doing all that filming, and it was amazing to me that they could reduce it down to the 3 minutes that it was. I hope you got a sense, though, for what goes on in the museum. When it was first started, over the years, it became almost like a warehouse. I mean, if you looked at it, just radios all over the place, but no particular organization. And so what we really try to do is turn it into a teaching museum. So when people come in, we don't just turn them loose to walk around. We try and give them a personalized tour depending on what their interests are. And we'll take them all through the museum and talk about how radio was discovered and developed and how what Marconi did and what Hertz did and so forth. It's actually really a lot of fun because you see how interested people get once they've actually taken the tour. I won't show them to you today. I've got them here, but I think I'll skip past them. We get lots of 5-star reviews. I mean, when people come to the museum, they really leave saying they enjoyed what they saw and what they learned. So it's been a lot of fun. Some of the people you saw in there, the older gentleman, his name is Clint Gorman. He's an amateur radio operator. Clint is now 96 years old, and still as strong and sharp as a tack. He's my Elmer, if you will. So when I joined the museum about 3 years ago, he's taken me under his wing and taught me a lot about how to repair radios and such. Ron Beaver, who is running our station there, is an amateur radio operator. I believe he lives in Waynesville, but maybe some of you will run across Ron at some point in time. And the instructor was making the point that they really enjoy bringing their students into the museum. We're in the Department of Engineering and Applied Sciences, so they teach the theory of electronics in the classes, but for them to be able to bring the students into the museum and actually put their hands on the radio equipment and see all these pieces, parts that the instructors were talking about goes a long way in helping them understand how things work. Let me show you a little bit of some of the things that we have in the museum that I think you'll find interesting. And I'm skipping over the ham equipment because, again, stuff I think most of you have seen before. But has anybody ever seen an antique Morse code practice machine like this? It's called an omnigraph, and it was made in the early 1900s. And so this is what people would use to try and build up their speed. The way it works is you have this wind-up mechanism here, like an old spring-wound clock or phonograph, and this is where the Morse code is. These are these little wheels with bumps on the outside, and this here is an arm which is like a telegraph key, if you will. And so there's a follower that's running along the edge of this disc, and it's making contact right here. We've got it hooked up to an oscillator. So the speed control is right here. There's a little ramp here, so when you turn this knob, the more you go up the ramp, the faster it sounds, and so you can regulate the speed on it. But it's a fascinating device. It's still in good working condition. And of course, when the TV stations or radio stations come in, this is what they always want to use as their background sound, because it just sounds so cool. You ever seen anything like this? Anybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
What is this?
It runs the tape through, and the tape is coded so that it sends the Morse code for you.
Well, this actually is a Morse code receiver. And so this again was made in the early 1900s. You can't see it in this picture, but there's actually a trademark on here. It says Evald Andersen Mekanska Etabel Copenhagen. So this is a Danish machine that was made in the early 1900s. When I got this thing, it actually came out of an estate sale in Asheville, and it was an estate sale of a person who used to be the newspaper editor. And so I don't know if this was ever used in the newspaper business, or how he came to get it, or how it wound up in Asheville from Denmark, but that's how we acquired it. So the way it works is on the back there's actually a 2-wire connection for the telegraph key, and then as you can see there's an electromagnet right here, and then on this side it's kind of hard to see because it's black, but there's a pulley. So would be a motor that's moving this pulley and operating the gears that are inside this box here, causing this tape to be pulled through. And as a dot or dash is received, this electromagnet, there's an arm here that gets pulled down, and when it gets pulled down, the paper tape is forced up on the other end against this ink roller here. So it records a short smudge for a dot and a long smudge for a dash. So if you cannot keep up with the code because it's coming in too fast, then you can read the paper tape, or if you're going off to the bathroom, you can pick it up off the floor. So we were glad to get this machine. I looked on the internet afterwards. These things are scarce as hen's teeth, and when you find them, they're running about $1,000 a piece. It turns out there's one on eBay right now, or just about to end, but that's about what they were asking for. And eBay came to the rescue as well on the paper tape. When we got it, it didn't have the paper tape, and this paper tape is obsolete. It's no longer made. But somebody found a box of new old stock paper tape, and it was exactly the right width, and the right outside diameter, and the right inside diameter. So now we have it on the machine. Has anybody ever heard the term coherer? What's a coherer? Steve back.
On a dot or dash with brings some filings together and then cohere and knocking loose.
Exactly. This of course is modern components. This is a modern reproduction of what Marconi would have been using back in the early 1900s. And so the thing that actually receives the signal or detects the signal is called a coherer, because in Old English, coherer meant to clump together. So as Steve was saying, you got an electrode here and an electrode here, and in this very small gap are some very fine particles. So when a radio wave is received from the antenna, it will cause these particles to clump together, and when they do, it would cause a bell to ring. So a short ring would be a dot, a long ring would be a dash. And if you notice right here, there's a wooden rod, and the purpose of the wooden rod is that every time you receive a dot or a dash, you have to shake the particles back down to reset the thing for the next dot or dash. So it's a pretty slow way of sending Morse code, but that's what they had back then.
Like an etch-a-sketch.
Yep. Exactly. Somewhere along the line, somebody came in and donated an album of photographs of early 1900 ham stations. So if you enjoy looking at old ham equipment, this is a fascinating album. In fact, I think I have this online. If you go to our website, you can't go to Asheville, you can probably look at it there. But you can see the date on this is 1916, 1917, and it shows what a ham shack would look like then. I think there's at least a dozen different ham shacks from that era that are all pictured in the album, so you might enjoy taking a look at that. This I found interesting. There's actually a building called the Miles Building in Asheville, and the guy who built the building back in the 1920s was an amateur radio chief, as a lot of people were. And so I think what he was doing here was trying two different tuning methods. So over here on this side, you have a more traditional coil and variable capacitor, and on this side he had this inductor. Has anybody seen or worked with this type of inductor before? You know who made this one? It's DeForest. This is a DeForest inductor, and you change the inductance by bringing these coils closer together and further apart. So I think what he was doing was he had this 3-pole double throw switch where he could change back and forth between the two different tuning methods. So really ham experimentation. I think some of you guys restore vintage radios. Does anybody have an Atwater Kent radio? A couple of you? Yeah, Stacy has one. You got one too? Atwater 20, 30?
Oh, it's the one in the coffin radio with the lid on it.
Yeah. Is it the big one or the?
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's an Atwater Kent Model 20, I think. Anyway, he was kind of an interesting guy. I don't know if you've ever read the history of Atwater Kent, but his father was a machine shop operator. And so when he was a young man, he used to have his own little room at the back of the machine shop. So when he got old enough, what he started doing was making small electrical appliances to sell, like desktop fans, you know, the old fans and such. But he made his first fortune actually making automobile ignition systems. When he had made enough money as a young man selling fans and such, he bought his first car, and the engine had one cylinder. And it was rough. And most of the engines back then ran roughly because they could not generate a strong enough spark consistently. So he decided he was going to invent a new ignition system. And in fact, Atwater Kent is the guy who invented what most of us guys from the 50s or 60s would think of as being the mechanical distributors we had in our cars. You know, the old called rotary kind that spun around, that had the condenser and the timing advanced retard built into it. So he made a fortune doing that. But when 1920 came around and he saw the opportunity, he decided to move out of, take the money he made on these ignition systems and put it into radios, building radios. You have any idea how many radios this guy made? Millions. He made, when he started out his first year, he made, I think, 1,600 radios. And by the end of the 1920s, he had 12,000 people working for him, and they're making more than 1 million radios a year. So he made a small fortune with radios. He got out when the prices started dropping. This I thought you might find interesting too. This big boat anchor here, this was the first police car radio in Asheville. So, not a walkie-talkie. You have to put this monster in the trunk. You can see these flanges on the side where you have to bolt it into the trunk. We actually have an article where we pulled out of the 1930s Asheville newspaper where the police chief is saying what a wonderful tool radio is for the police force. But can you imagine being a policeman and not having a radio? But back then they didn't. You just used call boxes. Okay, now this is something I don't think you've seen. Does anybody recognize this thing? This is the first wireless remote control that was made for home use. And it came out in the late 1930s, and it was called the Philco Mystery Remote. And the reason Philco called it a mystery remote was that it had no wires to connect back to your console radio. So you could literally carry this thing around your house, and you could change the stations or increase or lower the volume by using this thing. So how do you think it worked? No, it's not outside.
Was it acoustic?
No. It actually had a little oscillator inside. So you had batteries to operate the oscillator, and inside the console radio you had a separate little receiver that would receive the signal from this remote control. And so they would have, for example, a motor on the volume control. So if you wanted to raise or lower the volume, you'd use this dial, and it would send a signal and cause the motor to turn the pod either up or down, depending on what you want to do with the volume. So notice a couple of things about it. First of all, and you can't see it that well in this picture, but it actually is in a beautiful mahogany veneer cabinet. And the reason, again, is that back in the 1920s, radios were expensive, and they were designed to impress the neighbors. So you had it out where people could see it, that you could afford a radio like that. The other thing you notice is look at the user interface. What does that remind you of?
Telephone.
Telephone, exactly. So telephones, I think, started coming out around 1875, but by the 1930s, people were familiar with using a telephone to make things work. So Philco decided to set this up so you would dial the phone to make it work. Now, I know some of you folks recognize this. What is it? What is this radio?
Emergency radio, Gibson.
You got it. What's it called?
Pipe for antennas.
Yeah. We've got there's a tube that comes with this about that long, and inside there's an antenna wire, and there's a balloon, and there's a cylinder with helium in it that you use to fill the balloon. So you would send up your antenna from your life raft, and you turn the crank on the top up here, and it would send out a homing signal, and it would flash these lights. And the reason it's shaped the way it is because when you're sitting in your raft, you stick it between your legs, and so you can stabilize it so you can turn the crank. So that's a radio during World War II that could save your life. This here is a radio from World War II that could get you killed if you were caught listening to the wrong station. This is a German World War II Nazi propaganda radio. And it came with a tag on it, and we actually have the tag at the museum. And the tag says, "Think about this." The Fuhrer has said that it is a crime against the state to listen to a radio station outside of Germany. And if we catch you doing that, you can go to prison and hard labor, and at the end of the war, it was punishable by death. So a visitor told me recently that this radio is super heterodyne, and that the German military police actually had sniffers where they could drive around and they could pick up the signal from the oscillator in the super het radio, and from that they could tell you could listen to the radio, but they could also tell based on what oscillator frequency was coming out, whether you were listening to a German station or whether you're listening to the BBC or Voice of America. And if they caught you doing that, it could get really ugly. So it's kind of interesting radio too. Just a quick show of hands. Who restores vintage radios, 1920s radios? Anybody in here? These are a lot of fun. In fact, we spent a lot of time in the past couple of years just trying to expand our collection of the 1920s radios. These things fascinate me because I think back to the 1920s and what it must have been like for people to get radio for the first time. That you picture what it was like in rural North Carolina, and you're so isolated, and all of a sudden you've got radio. So I find them fascinating. And it also turns out they're fairly easy to repair. There's just not that much that can go wrong with them. The tubes in here, these old 1920s tubes, it's still possible to find these things readily on eBay. And so long as the filaments are good, if the tube is weak, you can regenerate the tube. Has anybody done that? Exactly. Yep. The early tubes, when they first came out, early triodes, they actually took an amp a piece. So if you're running a radio like this with 4 tubes, you're drawing 4 amps just for the filaments. But a few years later, in the 1920s, they changed the filaments in these tubes. The original tubes were just tungsten, like an Edison light bulb. And what they did was they added thorium to the filaments, and that makes them into a better emitter of electrons. And they were also able to reduce the power requirement from 1,000 milliamps to 250 milliamps. So they cut it by 75%. Something just happened? No. Okay. And then actually just a couple of years later, it was still in the 1920s, they came out with a new type of tube that only required 3 volts on the filament, and they dropped the current from 250 milliamps to 60 milliamps. So they went from 1,000 to 250 to 60, all in the 1920s. And that's what made it possible to actually run radios this size off of dry cell batteries. You know, those big cylinders that look like a soda can. You can run a radio like that off that. You may notice this piece up here, which of course is not 1920s. You think? Yeah. We came up with, I think, an interesting way of powering these 1920s radios. We actually use a wall wart for the filaments, or a power adapter, whatever you prefer to call it. But we can take a 6-volt wall wart that provides the power for the filaments. This thing here is called a buck converter. Has anybody heard that term before? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We can put 12 volts into this and get 90 volts out. And so that's how we provide the power for the plates. And then for the detector tube, it takes usually 22.5 or 45 volts. So we just use a Zener diode to drop it down for the detector tube. But anyway, it means we can put together a power supply for an old radio like this in probably a half hour or less, as opposed to building what they call an ABC battery eliminator, which can be a whole lot of work. And we've standardized on this in the museum, so we probably have a dozen or so radios that we've all restored that are working, and they're all set up with this. We usually hide this, but I have this one out so people can understand it. This is another example of one of the radios on display. This one was made by a company called Dayfan, which is a fan. It was Dayton Fan Company, but there's just a lot of companies that jumped in trying to make money off of radios when they came out. We have a scanner collection. Surely everybody in here has had a scanner at one point in time, listening to the police, fire. This is a whole series of scanners over the years. There's a CD radio collection as well. This is an interesting radio. It's you can't really tell the size of this thing from the picture, but it's actually a portable radio. It's a little bit too big to fit in your pocket, but it's not much bigger. Has anybody ever seen one of these, a Motorola Pixie? The thing that's interesting about this particular radio is the pencil tubes, the sub-miniature tubes. So just you can see by comparison, this is a miniature tube, like 12AX7 or something, and these are sub-miniature tubes. So they're very, very thin. Does anybody know the story of how these tubes came to be invented and why?
Just a guess, since they look like microwave ones, were they radar developed for clestrons or amplifiers?
You get to let us know. I'll tell the story. These tubes were actually developed during World War II by the Allies. You remember when the Germans were sending the buzz bombs into England and causing so much damage? The Allies wanted to have the ability to put a proximity detector into an artillery shell so that they could shoot the artillery shells at the buzz bombs coming in, and the proximity detector would sense it was near a buzz bomb and explode and try and destroy the thing while it was in the air. But in order to put a proximity detector into a artillery shell, these tubes were too big, and so it led to the invention of these tubes to be able to build those proximity detectors in World War II. And then after the end of the war, these tubes ended up being used in hearing aids and also in portable radios before the transistor radio started coming out. Anybody ever seen one of these? Guy walked to the museum with this one day and said, "Here, would you like it?" So we said, "Well, I guess so." This is a late 1940s child's toy, and it looks like a record player because it's got a tone arm, but this thing here is not a record. It's magnetic media like you'd find in an old floppy disk like we used to have in our computers. So there's a switch here that says play and talk, so that the child could switch it to talk and talk into the speaker, which would act like a microphone, and they could record whatever they're singing or saying onto this magnetic media. Then they move the needle back. The plastic thing here, by the way, is for tracking. There's a needle here that causes this to move smoothly across. So after the child was finished singing, they'd move this back to the beginning. They'd move this switch to play, and then they could listen to themselves again. This thing here is just a magnet. So if you want to race things, you just wave the magnet all across the floppy disk and you're able to re-record. Okay. Moving along. We try and get the young kids interested in radio and doing different things. So the younger people like to have things they can do hands-on when they're in the museum. So one of the things that we found that they all like to do, and in fact the adults do as well, especially if they're not hams, is spell out their name in Morse code. So we have a number of keys that are set up and a chart here where they spell out the name in Morse. We also have the spark transmitter. This was what we were demonstrating in the TV segment. And this is where the key is, and this is where the spark is. So we'll get them focused on the spark, and we'll turn on this little radio and hold it in our hand just to show that we're creating a radio wave. And they find that interesting as well. When we try to explain how radio wave works, we try to get them thinking about the relationship between electricity and magnetism. So we have this little generator here where we explain that there's a coil of wire in the center and they can crank it and that causes this light bulb to light. And that's part of the explanation that we give about how radio waves can be self-perpetuating. Anybody ever had one of these, one of those plasma domes? There's lightning inside. This is an old Radio Shack version that puts out some pretty good lightning, and we use this to show how there are natural sources for amplitude modulated radio signals, and then we play a little AM radio next to it so they can see how much interference it creates. And then we use that when we try and explain why things move to FM radio and the fact that FM is static free.
Bedenken Sie, die Lage anderer, viel größerer Staaten mit großen Reichtümern, mit gewaltigen Naturschätzen, mit wenig Menschen auf einem Quadratkilometer.
Recognize that voice? Yes, that's Adolf. One of our hams is, one of our volunteers is building some little MP3 players, and so we're putting them around the museum. So that one would be next to that Nazi radio, so the visitor can press the button and hear Hitler, and then we'll have some others around that play 1920s music and so forth. What we're looking at now is some of the community service things that we're doing at the museum, and I'll go through these quickly. But there's the Smoky Mountain Parkway system has a big radio system, but it's really getting old and long in the tooth. So they're trying to raise a lot of money where they can replace all the radios. So they had this fundraising event that they call the Smokies Stomp, and at all the tables around we had vintage radios for people to look at, just to tie into the theme. We're going out to, I guess your schools here in Winston-Salem probably have STEM nights or STEM weekends or something, where the kids are encouraged to learn about science, do hands-on things, so we go out and do events like that. This is kind of interesting too. Has anybody heard about the B-17 restoration project going on in Asheville right now? They have brought an old B-17 to the airport in Asheville, and their goal is to make it the most faithfully restored a B-17 bomber in the country. So they approached us about whether we would help with the radio equipment that needs to go into it, and it turned out that we had the exact radio they did. It was called a BC-348, and I think a lot of hams got those after the war because you could buy them and you convert them to AC power. It just so happened that we had one that had the original dynamotor that I think operates at 28 volts or whatever the voltage is on the airplane. So we donated that to them. And one of the hams who's not a member, but he's an associate of the museum, is helping them getting installed and getting restored and such. But anyway, the point being that we're really trying to be more involved with the community through the museum and get people interested and excited about attending. So we're doing these things. We give a lot of tours. A number of ham clubs have come through. We had of course, the Asheville group came through a couple weeks ago. We've had groups come in from Tennessee and Kentucky, other parts of North Carolina. So if this group is ever inclined to come over one day, we'd love to have you. We'll take you through the museum. I'd like to show you our website real quickly. We put a lot of effort into modernizing the website and making it what we think is interesting and useful as a resource. Especially if you're not able to come to the museum, these are some of the things that you can get. If you ever wanted to take another look at this video tour that was done by a Raleigh TV station a while back. This is the North Carolina Weekends segment that we did. This was Helen Chickering. And we have a nice new flyer on the museum as well, which you can download from the website. The website is avlradiomuseum.org. AVL is the airport abbreviation. So avlradiomuseum.org. Another thing that I think you'll find interesting if you're ever so inclined is our virtual tour, and we'll take a look at that in a second. We've tried to expand the content on our website so that it appeals to a broader audience. So we have the section on radio discovery and development. This is what we use for teaching the students when they come in about radio. And of course there's a section on amateur radio and also an extensive section on vintage home radio as well. Asheville got its first radio station in 1927. It was WWNC. It was funded by the Asheville Chamber of Commerce. And in today's dollars, I think it was about $500,000 that they raised to put this radio station on the air. But because we're in Asheville, we've gone and collected a number of the articles that were published back in the 1920s and 30s about the radio station. And these are some of the stars that were there for the opening. Asheville had a good, clear, strong signal. It's kind of impressive, actually, to read the old articles and to see what people said about the signal. And there were people as far away as Texas that were complimenting the station and how clear the signal was and the great selection entertainment that it had.
Stuart, what was the power of the station in wattage, do you know?
I don't. It's in one of the articles, and it's grown over the years, but I really don't recall off the top of my head. any farmers, I know your family is farmers, what impact do you think radio had on farmers in the 1920s when radio came out? Why would it have been big?
They get weather reports, market reports.
Yeah,
Same kind of thing they use today.
exactly.
Basically, their connection to the outside world from the isolation of the farm.
Indeed, indeed. And the same was true for a lot of rural North Carolina, because not that many people had phones yet. Sure.
Say, weather forecasting would be probably number one in their needs.
Weather forecasting was a big one, because until radio, they would not get the forecast early enough if a storm was moving in to be able to try and rescue their crops. Whereas with radio, there was enough advance warning they could try and bring in the crops. The pricing information was valuable as well, because it meant that farmers that lived near train stations could try and bring their livestock or crops to market on the days when the prices were highest. So very useful in that regard. Another thing that was extremely useful was the U.S. Department of Agriculture set up a college for farmers on the radio. So if you had a radio, you could get weekly broadcasts of things that were important to your farm, such as how would you use fertilizer to increase your crop yield, or if you had sick animals, how would you treat your animals. There were broadcasts for any of the women folk that were doing things like canning vegetables or fruit or whatever to help them with that. So it was just the internet of its day. It had a huge impact on farmers. It's amazing how the prices came down. I mean, if you were a poor farmer, like a lot of people would be in western North Carolina, you probably only had a crystal radio, because that's probably all you could afford. Because the 1920s radio, like the Atwater Kent, the one you were mentioning, a radio like that in the 1920s could sell for $80 when it first came out. And $80 in 1920 was like $1,000 today. So very expensive. Not everybody could afford a radio like that. There's an interesting story on our website. We have a whole section under the topics that has to do with radio for farmers. And you can see here what's interesting. The 1920s, 32 million people living on farms, and there's almost 1/3 of the total population of the United States. So, as mentioned, a lot of these were rural and isolated. So, radio, I think it's not in this quote, but somebody said it's the most important. Yeah, we'll do more for a farmer than other single factors.
Except the John Deere tractor.
Yeah, that had a little bit of effect too. This is the smartphone tour that I mentioned a little bit earlier. We took about 24 or more of the most interesting exhibits in the museum, and we created a smartphone tour. So if you're here in Winston-Salem and you wanted to take a smartphone tour of the museum, you can just go to our website and you'll see some easy instructions for how to do it. Basically, you're downloading a tour application which is called Uniguide, and then it's free. And once you have it installed, you can specify a city like say Asheville, and they'll bring up a list of all the tours in that city for which there's online guides. So here we are, the Asheville Radio Museum. So if you select this, you can either do it on the internet, or you can download it to your smartphone and listen up elsewhere. But you'll see a whole series of descriptions of some of the most interesting equipment we have in the museum.
On the phone, is the audio and video, or is it just audio?
It's just audio. We can't do the video yet. Although one of these days, I guess we'll try and put it on YouTube. This, by the way, is the flyer I talked about. If anybody cares to download a copy of it, you can get it from our website. We want to show you a few of these things very quickly, just in case you find them interesting. Of course, you don't have to go to the museum to get them. But has anybody in the room ever seen this book, Thunderstruck? The guy who wrote it, his name is Eric Larson, And he's a historic writer. He does very, very detailed research on whatever he's writing about, and then he puts it into a novel that makes for an extremely interesting read. So this particular one is Thunderstruck is on Marconi and everything that Marconi went through in trying to make radio useful. You may recall that the radio waves were proven to exist by a German scientist named Heinrich Hertz. I think we all know that name. We know frequency measurements named after Hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, and so forth. But it was Marconi that actually made radio useful. Marconi was a young man in Italy, and he read about the work that Hertz had done, and he somehow got his hands on plans to make a receiver and transmitter kind of like Hertz had used. And he discovered that a radio wave could actually be sent a longer distance than Hertz had thought, because Hertz was just thinking it could just go a few feet in a laboratory. So Marconi took his invention, or took his discovery to the Italian government, and they showed no interest. But as it turned out, Marconi's mother was English aristocracy. She was married to an Italian, but she was English aristocracy. So he told his mom, and his mom said, well, maybe England would be interested. Now, why might England be interested in something like radio?
Naval power.
Exactly, naval power. And they had no way of communicating with ships at sea unless they were in line of sight right off the coast. And they also had an empire, and so they wanted to be able to communicate quickly around the world. So Marconi goes to England, and he gets connected to the right people. And one of the interesting stories is that because his mother was English aristocracy, he gets introduced to the Queen of England. And he says what he's doing, and the Queen says, well, that's very interesting. My son, the Prince, is in a yacht race this weekend, and I'd really like to know how he's doing. So Marconi says, Queen, no problem. I'll take my transmitter out on a boat, and I'll send you updates back to the palace. And so he did, and then, of course, that gave him a certain amount of notoriety, and he got investors and so forth. But anyway, the story is told in Thunderstruck, and it makes for a very interesting read. This is one from a museum in Bellingham, Washington, that is put this on your bucket list. I mean, if you ever figure out a way to get to Bellingham, Washington, this was a Silicon Valley billionaire who decided he was going to assemble a collection of the most interesting radio and electric equipment on the planet, and he did. And he put it all into a museum, which is called the Spark Museum. So this book is filled with exhibits of the type of equipment that he has in his museum. And it is a fascinating book to own. You can buy this book on Amazon for about $13 or $14 used, and you'll be astonished at the collection this guy's put together. This is the book on Atwater Kent that I was talking about earlier. So he had actually produced 2 million radios by the end of 1928. And if you can imagine an operation this big in the 1930s, but 12,500 workers building radios for this man, he's turning out 6,000 radios a day. That's how big his operation was.
Where was his plant?
That I don't recall. It's mentioned in the book. I'm sorry, I just don't remember.
It was in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia?
There is an Atwater Kent Museum. But they don't deal with the radios. They deal with the old car parts.
He was quite the businessman. That's out of the book. That's again on his ignition system, which you can see. Yeah, the ignition systems for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-cylinder engines. This is a fun book for anybody who gets involved in vintage radios. It just has 100 old radio hookups in it. This one I just think is funny. This book is by Crosley. Anybody own a Crosley radio? Yeah. So he wrote this book in the 1930s to try and persuade people how simple radios were. So he titled it The Simplicity of Radio. This book is 78 pages of small print. So it was that simple. Why did it take 78 pages? And then, of course, on the ham radio side, we have a collection probably similar to yours, and we're just trying to bring in some of the newer things that are happening. Anybody in here using Arduino in their shack in some way? Any of the, how are you using them?
We were doing some test equipment with a signal generator.
Uh-huh. Well, they're fun to work with.
One of the guys in the club here is developing a system on Arduino to control our rigs in the radio room for make it so that no two people can grab the same antenna.
Mm.
It's basically a safety control,
Sure.
antenna control system.
Well, it sounds like good application. An Arduino, for those of you that are not familiar, is a little computer, a self-contained computer that's about the size of a cigarette package. And you can program it to do different things. And there's lots of good tutorials out there that explain how to do it. And there's lots of programs that are on the internet that you just download to do different things. These are fun. These are some of the old catalogs we've been able to get together on equipment. This one came from Montgomery Ward, and it was published in 1923. And you remember that experimenter's radio we looked at earlier, which had the DeForest coils? It's actually shown in this catalog. I think it was about $1.50 or something back then. This is the last one I'm going to show you, but I think you'll find it interesting. Has anybody ever seen this documentary? What do you think of it?
Great.
It really is excellent. I think we've all heard of Ken Burns. He does all the documentaries that are so good. Well, he did one called Empire of the Air on the men who made radio, and he focuses on three people. One is DeForest, who invented the Triode vacuum tube. One is Edwin Armstrong, and the third is David Sarnoff. Sarnoff created the first radio station network. What did Armstrong do?
Armstrong did the Super Heterodyne.
He did. Henry Jim and FM. So he was a pretty amazing inventor. When do you think FM was invented? Does anybody know?
Wasn't it before the war, Second World War? It was at 50 megahertz, or in the 50 megahertz band.
It was a lot earlier than I would think, because I mean the first time I had an FM radio was I think in the late 1960s, if I remember right. But Armstrong actually came out with FM way decades earlier, and the reason he did it was he was trying to solve the static problem on AM radio. So he came up with this brilliant design for FM, but he took it to David Sarnoff, and Sarnoff rejected it. He said, who in the world is going to want to buy another radio when they've all got AM radios already? I mean, it sold 7 million of them by the end of the 1920s. And so what Armstrong did was actually set up his own private broadcasting network up in the Northeast and seeded it with FM radios. And people began to realize how superior it was to AM, and I think that's what caused Sarnoff to finally come around.
Sarnoff put him out of business, too.
Well, you want to tell the patent story?
He got the FCC to change the frequency after Armstrong had set it up for the lower FM band.
Well, Armstrong died an ugly death. He involved in some patent suits, and he lost, and he ended up living in a hotel room, I think on the 8th floor, and then jumping out of the 8th floor hotel room and committing suicide. Shortly thereafter, the suit was, I think, settled in his favor, and his wife got all the money. Okay, this will be very quick. We're about to wrap up. Just want to mention that if you ever any of you doing the social networking thing, we're on Facebook. We're also on Yelp. We're on Explore Asheville, which is the Asheville tourism site. We're on TripAdvisor. We get nice reviews out there. And that's the end of the show. So I thank you very much for letting me explain the museum. I hope you found some of this interesting, and I hope one of these days you'll have a chance to come over and visit with us. Thank you.
That was great. We thank you for coming, Steve. That was great. Pleasure. We enjoyed that. Remember, No cake, goes home, all cake is eaten tonight. Plates, coffee, soda, and cake, it's great. Also, remember the business meeting next Monday night, 66 Pizza. Does anybody have anything else tonight? Yes.
I wanted to ask, that's at exit 44, right? If you're westbound, it's exit 44, for the AB Tech, down onto the Mountain Parkway.
It's, I don't recall the actual exit number, but I appreciate you asking me about that. We do have very detailed directions on the website. If you go to our website, at the very top, it'll say directions, and if you go there, we have where you can set your GPS. There's a QR code. You can scan that in, and it'll say, okay, you're here. This is how you get to the radio museum. There's a free parking garage where you can park. On our website, we have step-by-step pictures that say walk through this door, walk down this hallway, so you can't possibly get lost. And I didn't mention this, but we do not charge any admission to go to the museum. We welcome everybody, and we're just glad to have you.
Okay.
We need to get more people to come to the business meeting.
Yes, we do. We need to,
They want to get that presence.
have everybody involved. This is where we make our decisions. This is where, we decide what we're gonna do and how we're gonna do it, and we want everybody involved. It's a good time. So, everybody's welcome. What else? Okay, Harold, you've got a motion. I know you've got a motion. Do I hear a second? Okay. Meeting adjourned.